I'm Nathan Scott, and this is Breakdown, a series on game design. Supergiant is one of those rare indie companies that just came out of nowhere with high-quality games that were immediately successful. Their games aren't quite like anyone else's. They have a very unique visual style for sure, but the way they design them isn't quite like anyone else either. Supergiant takes some of the hard and fast rules of game design and breaks them to make their games better. Let's start with their first game, Bastion. A game design rule that goes back to at least the NES days is that when you introduce a mechanic, you should give the player room to mess around with it. For example, the beginning of most platformers lets you get a feel for jumping, attacking, or whatever the basic controls are without any obstacles. In the tutorial section of Bastion, when you first start walking, it has some narrow pathways, but they have barriers around them so you don't fall off while you're getting used to your movement speed. But then a second later, the game introduces the dodge roll, which is a more sudden movement, much harder to control than just walking around. As soon as they introduce that, they start leaving gaps in the barriers around the walkways, or even not putting any barriers in at all. That seems like it would be frustrating, so what lets Bastion get away with it? The difference is that Bastion's central mechanic is the narrator. Bastion's tutorial is just as much to introduce you to the movement and combat as it is to show you that the narrator responds to everything you do. The narrator reacts if you break too many objects, if you mess around for a while,
Kid just rages for a while,
or if you fall off.
and then he falls to his death. I'm just fooling.
The narrator responds to everything, and the game wants you to realize this. So by making it much more likely that you fall off in the beginning, the player quickly understands how the narrator works, and ideally is too caught up in how interesting the narrator is to be annoyed that they fell off the ledge. Their next game was a very stylish sci-fi game with a little less focus on the narration and more focus on the action. That game was called Transistor. Game design rule number 2, make the fights fair, and this is especially true for tutorial fights. In other words, you don't want players to take damage unfairly or feel like it's the game's fault when they get hit. If it's the player's fault, they know what to improve and how. In the beginning of Transistor, you almost always get hurt by the first enemy unless you've played the game before. When you walk up to it, it pops out and immediately starts attacking you. I watched several different blind playthroughs of this section online, and every single person took damage from essentially getting sneak attacked. Is that fair? Not really. They do this to make you feel like you're fighting against the odds, which your character very much is from the start of the game. The first line of the game is this:
Hey, Red. We're not gonna get away with this, are we?
and this fight reinforces your helplessness in the uphill battle you're fighting. And finally, Pyre. Game design rule number 3. Make the optimal solution the most interesting one, or at least the most interesting option for most people. If players can hyper-optimize the game to the point where it's no longer fun, they'll do it. This is why most games don't have obvious cheat codes, or the combat in stealth games is less effective than sneaking around. It might be fun for a little while, but it's not the intended, hopefully more interesting experience. But in Pyre, the optimal way to play is to lose every single game. Mechanically speaking, it doesn't make sense to win, because when you win, you get to free one member of your party from exile. That's great story-wise, but it gives you one less option for the rest of the game every time you win. Pyre makes it feel really important to win, even though from a gameplay perspective, it's not. Losing every single game on purpose is definitely not the most fun way to play, but it gives you the most options for future matches. Fortunately, no one plays Pyre like that. The only reason Pyre can get away with this is because the story and writing is so good that it changes how people play the game. It's important to remember that game design is still evolving, and it's pretty subjective, as much as videos like mine act like it's not sometimes, and ultimately, rules are made to be broken. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, and thanks for watching this episode of Breakdown.
There, dear reader. Now you understand. Or do you?